Sunday, December 3rd, day 58 of Hamas's war against Israel, 2 months since the crime against humanity that was October the 7th. We'll have updates on the return to hostilities with a live briefing from the IDF. Then we'll go to New York to hear from the exceptional Dr. Qanta Ahmed. I'm Michael Dixon, and this is Stand With Us TV Live. Shalom from here in Israel, and thank you for joining us for our weekly briefing. This is week 9, where we break down the war with Hamas and its global fallout. And we'll end tonight's program with a beautiful interview with Thomas Hand, Emily's dad. She was released this week. Stay with us. We're streaming live to Stand With Us social media platforms, as well as YouTube. And you can listen to this and all previous briefings on a podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So it's been another tough week for Israelis and anyone who loves Israel. We'll discuss the latest with the IDF spokesperson in just a moment. But first, a roundup on last week of Israel at war. Hostage releases that began the previous weekend continued this week. 114 people, mainly women, children, and Thai and other nationalities, were released. 121 hostages still remain in Hamas captivity in Gaza, and of those, 20 are women. Hamas is holding on to 16 bodies of Israelis who were murdered. That's a total of 137 people held by Hamas in Gaza. Hamas broke the temporary ceasefire with continued rocket fire towards Israeli communities. As a response, the IDF continued with a military campaign with the aims of returning the hostages, defeating Hamas, and ensuring they can no longer be a threat to Israelis. Rockets have continued to be fired from Gaza non-stop since Friday in their hundreds towards city centers across the south and in the center, such as Tel Aviv and Modi'in. Meanwhile, Iranian-affiliated terror organization Hezbollah have continued rocket and anti-tank missile attacks from Lebanon. And anti-Semitism is spiking. 73% of American Jewish college students have experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism since the beginning of the academic year alone, with similar reports globally. Pro-Hamas and anti-Jewish rallies and actions are taking place in multiple locations, including this week at the Christmas tree lighting at Rockefeller Plaza. Let's get the latest update now. Joining us live is IDF International Spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. Lieutenant Colonel, good to have you with us once again.
Thank you for having me, Michael. A pleasure, as always.
Thank you. And so the temporary cessation of hostilities came to an end this week, but prior to that, Israel was able to receive 114 hostages home. So tell us a little about the scenes that we saw and the state of the hostages, and about how Hamas used this for their PR.
Yes, a lot to unpack. Really very emotional week for so many families in Israel, and I think for everybody, any human being that has a heart couldn't help but be moved by the scenes that we saw. Women, children, and others, well, the elderly who came back from 51 days, 52 days of hell underground in Hamas captivity. And, you know, it was emotional to see. As someone who deals with media and many times looks at things through the lens of how things are choreographed and how things are photographed, I could see, as a media professional, I could see how much effort Hamas put into these release scenes, especially in the beginning, in order to send or to try to cultivate an image of humanity and of a benign organization and a friendly contact between the Hamas terrorists that were keeping the hostages violently in Gaza and the hostages when they were being released. And we know from firsthand testimony of released hostages who said that they were instructed very clearly by Hamas people that they must smile and wave and be friendly towards the Hamas terrorists as they were being handed over, even forcing them to hold hands with the terrorists that forced them to stay in Gaza. So there's a lot of psychological warfare. We also saw, parallel to the beautiful sights of Israelis being reunited with their families, we also saw the machinery that Hamas has put in place to conduct psychological warfare against the families and against Israel or Israelis as a whole. The terrible use of splitting families, keeping one part of the family, mostly the men, still in captivity, releasing women and children, which is a very cynical thing to do, and it ensures, from a perspective of Hamas, that the hostages won't tell their full story yet. And what we've been encountering on social media and in the media are claims by people, usually people who don't support Israel and are Hamas supporters, who say, why aren't the hostages talking? And let the hostages talk, which is, of course, they're trying to insinuate that somebody is keeping them from talking. Well, the only people that are keeping our hostages, our released hostages, from speaking are their loved ones that are still in Hamas captivity. And that's a very cynical move by Hamas, another one where they're exploiting the feelings and the vulnerability, which I think is absolutely despicable, but it will not weaken our resolve. And as the fighting has commenced again, we are now fighting in northern Gaza, and we are fighting in the south as well, and we will continue to fight until we eradicate Hamas, until we get all of our hostages back, and until we can say clearly and unequivocally that Hamas has been defeated and it is safe for Israelis to return home.
And so let's talk about the front line. The IDF finds itself in the precarious position of trying to remove Hamas from the south of Gaza while minimizing harm to the civilians that Hamas is hiding within. So what's the plan?
Yeah, Israel is under quite a lot of attention and even, I could say, pressure, even from some of our best friends around the world that are focusing a lot of attention on this. And it is an extremely complex situation. I don't think that any other military has faced such a situation where there are our civilians within a few kilometers of distance that we need to protect and defend. Then there's the enemy who is embedded underneath the Palestinian population and civilians, using them as human shields, using everything that is supposed to be protected and special and off the battlefield, like schools, mosques, hospitals, clinics, and UN facilities. All of those things are supposed to be off the battlefield, but Hamas uses all of them and hides beneath or behind them. And that forces us to fight where Hamas is. Now, unfortunately, Hamas isn't fighting us out in the open, and they're not in the agricultural areas around the populated areas. They are embedded deeply within where the civilian population is. And if we want to defeat Hamas, and we do, because we have to do that, we have no other choice but to take the fighting to where Hamas is hiding. And what we are trying to do simultaneously is to send a message to the Palestinian civilians to vacate certain areas, each area according to specific timing, and we're informing them, the civilians, ahead of time where the fighting is going to be, at risk for our own troops. And this is also quite unique. And the map that you can see is, it's very, if we zoom in, then you can see that it's basically Gaza divided into very small segments or perimeters. It's basically based on neighborhoods. So we can tell people living in a certain neighborhood, whether it is northern Gaza, central or southern Gaza, and informing them ahead of time that we are going to operate there and that they need to vacate. But not only go away, but we tell them where to vacate, where the safest place to be is going to be, because we do care about the survival of non-combatants. They are not our enemy. Hamas is our enemy. Hamas launched this war against us. We're going to defeat Hamas, and we want to defeat Hamas with the minimal possible effect on civilians. But I have to tell you completely honestly that this is a very challenging task, And it doesn't help that many of the humanitarian organizations in Gaza who are allegedly supposed to help civilians aren't helping us help Palestinians. And I think that is a shame and an atrocity. And I really hope that will change and that we will have more support in doing what's right on the battlefield.
And you mentioned the cynical use of the opportunity to free hostages this week by Hamas, and we saw really a grotesque cavalcade where hostages were marched out. You mentioned what they were asked to do, but also, you know, the production value, the lighting, etc. And there were also mobs who were not only climbing all over the vehicles that were escorting them out, but they were all taking pictures and selfies and videos of what was going on. And so I know that some of the media have been questioning the amount of electricity in Gaza right now, but they certainly had electricity to do that. And I guess my question to you is, how are you ensuring then that they get the message in terms of this map that we saw, where to vacate to and what to do?
Yeah, we have gone as wide and as deep as we can in disseminating this. We've done it, of course, through sent it to cell phones by various ways. We have published it on our website. We have sent voice messages. We have sent text. And for those who may not have cellular reception or may not have electricity, we have also dropped leaflets. Now, it is, of course, an imperfect situation. And we are not claiming that the situation is perfect, but we are at war. And we are doing the best we can, sincerely, in order to provide what we think is the best possible solution for civilians who are currently in an area that is going to be very dangerous. So we've said it on radio, we've dropped leaflets, we are doing it on the internet, and every possible way. We've also disseminated through the humanitarian organizations, UNRWA and the others, informing them of what we're doing. Whatever way possible, we're doing it because our interest is to get those human shields, the Palestinian civilian population, away from Hamas terrorists. If we can do that, then we will be fighting the terrorist alone, and then it will be a swift and decisive battle, and hopefully civilians will not be injured and not be affected. I want to say that we understand and feel that it is a tough situation on the ground for Palestinian civilians who may not be affiliated with Hamas. And to them, we say, we understand that you are in distress. We understand that this is a highly uncomfortable time for you and your family. But what you need to do is to do the smart thing. Don't be used by Hamas as a human shield. Vacate when we tell you to evacuate. And then you have a very good chance of protecting yourself and your family. If you don't, then you're making a very grave mistake, one that could possibly have mortal consequences, and we do not want that. So please heed our warnings and let the fighting be contained only with combatants and not have civilians in harm's way.
And the IDF scored some major successes this week, taking out major terrorist leaders. Tell us about the advancement.
Yeah, so we are advancing well according to plan. There's a lot of joint operations between the IDF and then the ISA, Shabak in Hebrew, the Israeli Security Agency, who provide excellent intelligence. And then a lot of the strikes are done from the air by the Air Force, but also a lot of friction and intelligence is generated by the fact that we have troops on the ground that are applying pressure on the enemy. The terrorists understand that there's really nowhere to go. We're closing in from various locations, and that generates a lot of intelligence, and then we're able to strike where they are. We have taken out quite a lot of the senior combatants, people that are important, enemy combatants that are important to run operations against us. Many of them were very important in launching the attack, the massacre of October the 7th, and some of them are really notorious terrorists that go back to 2005, killing Israelis. So some of them have a long pool of blood, or a deep pool of blood that they have been filling, unfortunately. And we have now finally settled the score with them. And it's important to say, now we're dealing with battalion commanders and brigade commanders. We will get our hands or our missiles on Yahya Sinwar, on Muhammad Def, on Ismail Hania, and on Khaled Mashal. All of them, all of these Hamas seniors, wherever they are, inside or outside of Gaza, will be targeted by Israel, and it is only a matter of time before we get to each and every one of them who were behind the atrocities of October the 7th.
And so, as we head into the next week, what should we expect? And what are the messages that you would like the Stand With Us audience to know and take forward and share with their platforms and their networks?
I think it's really important to amplify the extent and the effort that the IDF is undertaking, including at certain risk for our own troops, because we are advertising ahead of time where we're going to operate. And that means risk for our soldiers. And it's something that I think no other military does or has done in this type of conflict. I think that isn't amplified enough in international media, definitely not in the places where I get interviewed, me and my colleagues. And I think that is something that needs to be emphasized. Second thing is, just like you started in the beginning, there are still 137 Israelis, most of them alive, many of them children and women, but men also have feelings and they are also suffering in Hamas captivity. And we are talking about 137 Israelis that are being held and need to come home. And the last thing is, for those who may encounter friends or others who want this war to end and look at Palestinian suffering and are moved by it, I understand that. The message to them is very clear. The choice is with Hamas. If Hamas says, we surrender, and Yahya Sinwar and all of the other coward terrorists, they'll emerge from their tunnels, hiding behind Palestinian civilians and maybe Israeli hostages. They'll come out with their hands up and they'll give us back our hostages, live and well. I'm sure that the war would come to a very quick conclusion. And the choice is with Hamas. We have no choice but to continue to fight. Hamas has a choice. If they care about the civilian population, if they care about the situation in Gaza, if they really do, then they can end the fighting quite quickly. It's not in my place to say if we really would accept it, but something tells me that we probably will, because it would mean that we would achieve all of our aims. And for those of you who have conversations with people that are concerned with the Palestinian wounded and killed and destruction, tell them to tell Hamas to surrender. The war would be over very quickly. And I think that is something that isn't emphasized enough. There's a lot of focus on Israel, not enough on the choices made, the active choices made by Hamas and what that means for the civilian population. And the last thing I will say is stand strong. Don't be confused by things that are said about Israel. Don't listen to the slander. Take every piece of critique that you're confronted with at face value, disseminate it, listen to the reports, the verified reports coming out of Israel, the IDF, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, spokespersons from the Israeli government. There's solid, verified information coming out. And before you believe in anything that is thrown at Israel, listen to what we have to say. Most of the time, we're trying to do what's good and what's right. And most of the time, we also succeed. And that, I think, is a very important message. And you can trust that we are doing our best to do, we're trying our best to do the right thing here, including when it comes to Palestinian civilians and minimizing the effect on the civilian population. But we shouldn't be confused. We are at war, a war that was forced upon us, and a war that we are going to end victorious. Everything else is small details.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this update, and we wish the troops safety and quick success. Lieutenant Colonel Conricus, thank you very much once again for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, our next guest is a physician, an author, and a journalist. She regularly provides commentary focusing on Islam, Islamism, and terrorism on multiple TV networks. She's given testimony to the US Congress and given addresses in the British Parliament, the Council of Europe, the Knesset, and many other prestigious locations. In 2010, she became the first physician and the first Muslim woman to be awarded the Templeton Cambridge Fellowship in Journalism. She's received an honorary fellowship from Israel Technion Institute, and she recently came to bear witness to what happened on October the 7th. Take a look at her trip to Israel. Joining us now from New York, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Qanta Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
And I want to discuss your recent visit to Israel, but before that, what motivated you to come at this time in the first place?
I had an extraordinary opportunity. 5 years ago, I visited the Hamas tunnels at the Gaza border and learned about hybrid warfare from then Deputy Commander of the Gaza Division, Colonel Kobe Vela. And when the attacks happened, I was checking on all of my friends, including Kobe. And after a day or two, he said, would I like to come and see? And for me, I felt that was a pivotal, life-changing decision. I took that very seriously. And my decision was clarified very quickly within about 48 hours in the United States and elsewhere, when the actual reality or the truth of the attacks was already being called into question. And you're familiar that even the Queen of Jordan debated as to whether the atrocities had occurred. And it was the barbarity of that denial which clarified for me that I had to go and see for myself as a non-Israeli, as a non-Jew, as a physician, to be able to tell the world that this is true. I do believe I saw features that would characterize the events as a genocide. And that was what motivated me to be able to go.
So tell us what you saw and experienced in post-October the 7th Israel.
I was able to go immediately. On October 20th, I was in Kibbutz Be'eri. I went also to other kibbutzim nearby. I walked through the homes where murders had occurred, and there was clear evidence of the murders present both in the kitchen, in the dining room, in the safe rooms. It was surreal in the most horrifying way. I was able to see the workers from the Zaka section who handle human remains. I could see young soldiers serving the IDF who'd already been bereaved. I went from there and actually began speaking in that evening, the late afternoon in Kibbutz Be'eri, even to survivors who were coming back to their homes for the first time. I had permission as a lay volunteer from the Shoah Foundation to take video testimony. I did that now, actually just take the sixth person, adults, elderly, even children, telling me about what they had seen and experienced as they were attacked by the Hamas terrorists. And of course, the people speaking to me had survived, but many of their families and communities had lost their lives. I also was able to speak to a very important unit, the 585 unit, the Bedouin Trackers Commander, and their soldiers, and how they had confronted Hamas in the early hours of October 7th and regained control of important military installations and defended the nation, the state of Israel. It was very important to me as a Muslim to meet the Israeli Bedouins who are also Muslim and recognize that Hamas is an Islamist, jihadist, lethal threat. And it was their moral duty, not only their military duty, but their moral duty to defend the country against it.
And you've said we shouldn't call October the 7th a massacre, but instead a crime against humanity. Why so?
Well, part of what I was also able to see was to go to the Shura which is the military base by Ramle, and to see the morgue where initially bodies arrived by the hundreds, and speak to the police workers, speak to the military workers, speak to CSI, very seasoned detectives, walk in the refrigerated containers, look at the remains of human beings that were still waiting identification, and go from there to Abu Kabir and actually inspect the bodies of people that had been murdered by Hamas. And for me, that was critical that I do that personally. I was given full access, not only to where the remains of human bones and human teeth were being carefully studied, but also where bodies were being brought with no identity, and looking at them like a physician with pathologists to understand how the murders had happened. And when you look at these bodies, they have been murdered numerous times in many different modes. That means they've been stabbed, they've been shot, they've been macerated and crushed by vehicles. I personally saw cadavers with the wrists still restrained with zip ties. They're brought in like that because these are murders and they have to be documented and investigated in that manner. And unfortunately, there was not sufficient attention until recently, though Israel has been investigating this from the outset. The crimes against women and girls, the crimes that were committed to the unborn, to me, they speak very much of a serious attempt to eradicate a race based on its identity, and that is the eradication of the Jewish person, the Jewish child, the Jewish elderly, and the Jewish unborn. And I am not a human rights lawyer, but these crimes very much speak to me of genocide. I think it is also explicit in the Hamas charter that they have themselves called for genocide repeatedly. Even since this attack, they have called for further attacks of the same nature. And so I encourage the international community to look at these crimes through that lens and have prosecutors and experts in human rights decide if this truly was genocide. To me, it seems to be. And there is some basis which is also supporting that. I want to bring your audience's attention to a remarkable French attorney, Francois Zimmeret, who is based in Paris, who's already representing, I think, 11 families from Israel who have lost loved ones, and has brought them to the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court to give testimony about what happened to their family. He's already filed a complaint about genocide and filed an international request for an international arrest warrant for the leaders of Hamas that our colleague from the IDF was just speaking about. So this is much more than terrorism from what I can see, though I'm speaking to you as a physician.
And you mentioned the crimes against women and girls. What is your take as to, or your best guess, as to why these crimes were minimized and actually even ignored by organizations like UN Women for so long?
Well, it's inexplicable to me, other than there is some belief that the body of Jewish girls and Jewish women, when they are weaponized for war, when they are exploited in the most base and dehumanizing methods, somehow are accorded a different status, which is completely unacceptable to civilized society. I think that I don't understand it. I'm absolutely proud that my organization, of which I'm a senior fellow, the Independent Women's Forum, issued a press release, wrote to the White House, and made a call for that to be recognized. And we did that on Friday. And we're now seeing the United Nations respond and recognize that these crimes against women and girls have committed. I also think the evidence is so overwhelming, and this additionally adds my concerns about a genocide being perpetrated. Hamas documented in minutiae every crime, murder, every debasement of a human being, an animal, everything they documented, and they came with the intention to document. The intention to document means that you did plan this kind of eliminationist anti-Semitism, this kind of a literal extermination. I was also able to be present at Camp Herzog in the Glilot military base while I was in Israel, seeing the first screening put together to the world's press. We were not able to bring any recording materials in there, but to see the atrocities that Hamas had themselves recorded and celebrated and feted and then disseminated. That kind of dehumanization is designed to further terrorize members of the community that survived or members of the community that might be their next victims. It is an extreme act of violence, extremely intimate methods of killing, which surpass almost anything that we've heard of. And we do know of the Rwanda genocide. We do know of the genocide ISIS perpetrated against the Yazidis. So there's many levels of evidence which would point to the fact that this was much more than a terrorist attack, albeit a very planned one.
And so, having seen that footage, having witnessed the sites of this mass killing, having gone to Abu Kabir to see the Forensic Institute, and then seeing the footage from the scenes in America and indeed other countries, ranging from college campuses to city council meetings where people deny or minimize or even justify what Hamas did. How do you rationalize that?
So first of all, it's an extremely low point for the United States. We seem to have lost all ability to communicate. The protests, I've spent my career in universities, the protests from the universities are extremely disturbing. Our youth, I think, in the United States has been deeply radicalized. This does not mean that I don't have terrible anguish about the civilian loss of life of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children who are not affiliated with Hamas. I think it's devastating. As a Muslim, I feel complicity because the Muslim Arab world has not found itself capable of alleviating the pressure on these innocent people and allowing them to escape the theater of war that Hamas is operating in. And so that's a very difficult scenario for us to see as Muslims, whereas we've seen the fleeing populations from the Ukraine conflict, the fleeing populations from the Syrian war, the fleeing populations from the conflict in Libya. I mean, it's endless. But somehow the Arab Muslim world and the Muslim majority world has decided not to alleviate that human suffering in an obvious way, which would be to move them out of the way from harm without changing territorial relationships on the ground. So we're almost subjecting the Palestinians to take the full brunt of conflict, which is aimed at Hamas, and Hamas is utilizing and exploiting these innocent people. So that's extremely difficult. Coming back to the United States, this event has revealed to me anti-Semitism has become mainstreamed. Anti-Semitism is legitimized, including by Hollywood actresses, some of our most expensive universities, some of our most prestigious institutions, our state, local, and federal politicians are tolerating this. And if there is any silver lining, I am relieved to understand the depth at which this kind of anti-Semitism has taken root, because we must now combat it in very tangible ways. This is not hashtag activism. This is going to require lawsuits and penalties. In the United States, we absolutely protect the right to religious identity, the right to religious freedom for all, and that there cannot be a situation in which Jewish people in the United States are afraid of wearing religious symbols, afraid of going to their places of worship, afraid of being discriminated against. That is absolutely illegal, and we now need to enforce those laws. At the same time, this is a clarion call about the radicalization of our youth, which is completely enmeshed with Islamism. If we just talk about that for a few moments, Michael, Hamas, in their actions on those bodies and on those people that I saw, was expressing violent Islamism. There is no violent Islamism, hostage taking, suicide bombing, mass terror events like 9/11 or the Bataclan. None of that happens without non-violent Islamism. Nonviolent Islamism is very established in the United States, the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. Part of that glorifies the Muslim as a victim. I'm not a victim in the United States. I have the most privileges I could have had, perhaps even from my original place of birth, Britain, here in the United States, in terms of legal protections, rights, all kinds of opportunities, earning power, and so forth. But the Muslim Brotherhood indoctrinates Muslims to be victims, to create not parallel societies, as I've said before, but closed societies where they're not penetrable, and then they use democracy to exploit privilege in order to tyrannize minorities. That's what we're seeing. Our Jewish minorities in America are in absolute fear. I have met Jewish colleagues, friends, their children who are at risk for showing their religious symbols, at risk for going to places of worship, at risk for revealing that they are Jews. This is a tyranny, and this is being driven by sympathies with Islamism and with the woke left. It is very dangerous for the health of the United States as well as for American citizens. So it's a blessing that we know the threat is so serious, but we must act not merely through social media, but with every means. And maybe that brings us to a final point, which is, why should a Muslim or a non-Jew or a non-Israeli or a Christian become involved? Because if we're going to allow October 7th to occur and be silent, we become complicit. There is no neutral position as a bystander. And if you think one voice doesn't make a difference, one voice can make a tremendous difference, even if it comes at the expense of social exclusion and being rendered a pariah and losing relationships and friendships and perhaps even employment. Somebody needs to speak, because we know when no one speaks, when there's a feeling that entire nations are silent, this gives license to Hamas and similar groups to perpetrate their acts. I remind you, we have not fully eliminated ISIS. ISIS is resurgent in ungoverned areas between Iraq and Syria. This is enlivening all Islamist groups. We've seen this afternoon the news in Paris, where somebody has exacted retribution in an act of jihadism that the Paris authorities are investigating, and a German citizen has lost their life. This is all connected, and each of us has a role to prevent that. And it's quite independent of politics. It's quite independent of standing with Israel. In my opinion, standing with those victims in Kibbutz Be'eri and in other places in the southern Gaza envelope area is standing with humanity. If you're not standing with humanity, you are legitimizing Hamas, and that is completely immoral.
And so what would you say to those people, maybe predominantly young people, who are, making these kind of statements that we've spoken about, and letting them, how would you let them know that the battle against Hamas is relevant to them too, Jewish or not Jewish?
I think it's very difficult to have a dialogue with an individual who's already been indoctrinated. But alongside the indoctrinated are the followers, or those who barely understand Islam, let alone Islamism. There's a huge need to explain who Hamas is without lending it legitimacy or glamour. There is a huge need to explain that when I wrote on, as the war began, Israel's jihad is my jihad, that does not mean Israel is a jihadist. It means Israel's battle against jihadism is the battle every Muslim army. Egypt has fought against this. Pakistan has fought against this. Saudi Arabia has just expunged Islamist ideology from its entire landmass. These are wars that we have been fighting as Muslims for the legitimacy of Islam. And this is another front. This is no different than the women and girls who were enslaved to ISIS. 4,700 women still remain enslaved to ISIS in the Yazidi population. So the event of October 7th needs to be incorporated within the last 25 years, and particularly with the war in ISIS, so that there can be some perspective. And also, it's very important that we protect, even as a believing Muslim, we have no right to prevent another individual from observing their religion. In fact, it's our duty to protect them and allow them to observe their religion. And maybe think not about a geopolitical conflict 8,000 miles from here, but think about, how am I treating my neighbor? How am I treating my co-worker? How am I treating my fellow believer in God who needs to worship on Saturday when I need to worship on Friday? Let's bring it back down to the individuals, but we also need very potent examples from those in power, very clear messages, including, I think, the opportunity to speak to Congress and testify about what I have seen, what the survivors have gone through, what the rescued hostages have seen, to create those opportunities at Senate committees, to create those opportunities in the United Nations, the European Parliament, and the International Criminal Court. This is going to be a massive undertaking that is going to very much outlast the current war that is ongoing at the moment.
Very, very important. Before we wrap up, there will be many, I am sure, that are watching and thinking, how can we ensure there are more voices like Dr. Qanta Ahmed out there? What's your answer to that?
I would say, I think that there are many voices. You know of them, and they have joined you on this platform. I think everything begins with a relationship with what might be considered the other. This concept of otherization, where we have an in-group, and for instance, if one is an Islamist, the Jew is an out-group, Jewry is an out-group, Judaism is an out-group, the State of Israel is out. That is extremely damaging. Break those rules. Go outside of your group. Learn from others. Take a risk, but do so with the right intentions, not to prove a point, not to win an argument, but to truly learn. This is a point of human suffering that we're all experiencing. And there is a real risk that Hamas could glamorize jihadism once again, as we saw ISIS doing. We don't want that. I also think questions should be asked. There are many that are complicit in this, not only Hamas. Where were the raw materials provided for their warfare? Not just missiles from Iran or magazines from Kalashnikovs that I saw from Syria. That's not the only complicity. Where did all of the raw materials come for their tunnels, the concrete, the electrical wiring? How could it be that we're learning, at least reported in the Jerusalem Post, that 2 hostages report being held hostage by those that had been employed by UN agencies? There is a very wide net to cast, tremendous responsibility, hundreds of millions of dollars pouring in annually, 100 million from Iran, I think 120 million from Qatar, going into Gaza. Who has been responsible for the governance and the transparency of the accounting of that money? Who can say that they don't have a role in the terrible destruction and loss of life that we're seeing? Those questions need to be asked by lawyers. Those questions need to be asked by human rights investigators, prosecutors. We need to help them as much as possible. And that starts with critical thinking. And you can do that with your own community, breaking out of groupthink. That's very, very important.
Absolutely. I would encourage our audience to follow Dr. Ahmed all across social media. Dr. Ahmed, we appreciate your voice so much, and we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for the wonderful opportunity, Michael.
Thank you so much. A powerful and important voice. And before we go, let me show you a ceremony that was held. 17 Thai nationals who were released from Hamas captivity in Gaza over the last few days. They left Israel's Shamir Medical Center. They're now on their way back to the airport, and this ceremony was held before they went home to Thailand. Shalom, shalom, shalom. And we are so glad they're able to return home safely. And another person who came home was 9-year-old Emily Han. Her father, Thomas, spoke powerfully to the world's media as he called for her release. And he sat down with Ilana Dayan to talk about being reunited with his daughter.
It was perfect, like a scene in a film, which is how I imagined it, you know, running along the beach and scooping them up.
ואז הוא מתקשר אליי, והיא אומרת לי, נטלי, בקול חלש וקטן. זה היה הרגע שבו הבנתי שאיתן.
When she came out, her volume in her voice was almost just moving her lips. There was no air coming out. There was no volume to what she was saying. I had to put my ears totally on her lips, literally and I still couldn't really hear what she was saying.
Is there stuff that you're afraid to ask?
We've been told not to pull. I want to pull. I want to, you know, what did you do? I want to interrogate her, debrief her, if you will. But no, you have to just do little tugs on a thread, and hopefully she'll, in time, come out with what she wants to come out with.
סתם, כאילו בחדר, אז פתאום היא עושה אוסקוט. לאנשים כאילו שמעצבנים אותו, בא להגיד להם רגע שקט, אוסקוט. ביסקרויט. ולא הבנתי מה זה ביסקרויט. חושבת על ביסקוויט, מה הקשר? אז שאלתי אותה, מה זה אומר? אמרה לי, להיות בשקט, be quiet. כנראה שככה הם אמרו את זה.
אוסקוט be quiet.
כן. תמיד שהיא אוכלת, אז היא מציעה לי קודם ולכולם קודם.
שזה לא היה ככה לפני?
לא. אז היא מציעה קודם, וגם אם אני אומרת לה שאני לא רוצה, אז היא עושה, נו, תאכלי, נו, בשבילי. וזה לא היה ככה. שאלתי אותה אם הם היו מציעים, כאילו, הם היו אוכלים ביחד, ומציעים כזה למי שיותר רעב, או מתחשבים בכולם, אז היא עשתה לי כן עם הראש.
So what's the plan, Tom?
Fix her. Fix my broken child. Fix my broken baby.
איזה? עם החור הזה?
כן, חור.
The one thing that I'm determined to do, when she's recovered enough, I'm going to find out where and if Beyonce is touring, and I don't care where it is in the world, she's going. She adores her.
I fought for you the hardest. It made me the strongest.
Will you go back to Barry? I know we are asking it time and time again.
We ask ourselves all the time.
I bet.
I found a paradise on earth for 30, 31 years, and overnight it was turned into hell. But still, they will never defeat us. We will rise from the ashes of that morning.
It's amazing to listen to such pure Zionism with an Irish accent.
Yeah, I wasn't even aware that was Zionism.
No, heaven couldn't wait for you.
עשי שלום. סתם, את לא חייבת.
הם מכירים אותנו או משהו?
הם מכירים מהחדשות? גם שניצל מפורסמת.
ואומנם לא היה לך כרטיס חזור מאוסטרליה, אבל חשבת שכשתקני כרטיס חזור זה יהיה כרטיס חזרה לבארי?
לא. לא רציתי לחזור לקיבוץ.
ועכשיו יכול להיות שמשהו משתנה או לא בהכרח?
איפה שאמילי תהיה, אני אדאג להיות קרוב.
A long road to recovery for this family, but we're so pleased they're reunited. As always, the Stand With Us team is working around the clock and around the world to fight the information war, to provide support for students of all ages, and to give legal help in the fight against anti-Semitism, and so much more. If you'd like to support our work before the year end, please go to standwithus.com/donate. That's standwithus.com/donate. We're sending love to the Israeli troops and to our brothers and sisters and allies worldwide. Stay strong, and our prayers for every hostage to be back home with their families soon. Thank you for watching. Israel Chai.